And the ideas that I had in recent years have a great overlap with a lot of the things that you are working on. And when I listened to your Lex podcast last night, there were many thoughts that you had that I had stumbled on that I've never heard from anybody else. And so I found this very fascinating and thought, maybe let's look at some of these thoughts first and then go from there and expand beyond those ideas. But I, for instance, found after thinking about how cells work, kind of obvious but missed by most people in neuroscience or in science in general, is that every cell has the ability to send multiple message types and receive multiple message types and do this conditionally and learn under which conditions to do that and to modulate this. Also, every cell is an individual reinforcement learning agent. Single-celled animal that tries to survive by cooperating with its environment gets most of its rewards from its environment. And as a result, this means that every cell can in principle function like a neuron. It can fulfill the same learning and information processing tasks as a neuron. The only difference that exists with respect to neurons, or the main difference, is that they cannot do this over very long distances, because they are mostly connected only to cells that are directly adjacent. Of course, neurons also only communicate to adjacent cells, but the adjacency of neurons is such that they have axons, parts of the cell, that reach very far through the organism. So in some sense, a neuron is a telegraph cell that uses very specific messages that are encoded in a way like Morse signals in extremely short, high energy bursts that allow to send messages over very long distances very quickly to move the muscles of an animal at the limit of what physics allows. So it can compete with other animals in search for food. And in order to make that happen, it also needs to have a model of the world that gets updated at this higher rate. So there is going to be an information processing system that is duplicating basically this cellular brain that is made from all the other cells in the body of the organism. And at some point, these two systems get decoupled. They have their own codes, their own language, so to speak, but it still makes sense, I guess, to see the brain as a telegraphic extension of the community of cells in the body. And for me, this insight that I stumbled on just because means and motive, that evolution would equip cells with doing that information processing if the organism is long enough, lives long enough, and if the cells share a common genetic destiny so they can get attuned to each other in an organism. That basically every organism has the potential to become intelligent, and if it gets old enough, to process enough data to get to a very high degree of understanding of its environment in principle. So, of course, a normal houseplant is not going to get very old compared to us, because its information processing is so much slower, so they're not going to be very smart. But at the level of ecosystems, it's conceivable that there is quite considerable intelligence. And then I stumbled on this notion that our ancestors thought that one day in fairyland equals 7 years in human land, which is told in the old myths. And also, at some point, I revised my notion of what a spirit is. For instance, a spirit it's an old word for the operating system for an autonomous robot. And when this word was invented, the only autonomous robots that were known were people and plants and animals and nation states and ecosystems, right? There were no robots built by people yet. But there was this pattern of control in it that people could observe that was not directly tied to the hardware, that was realized by the hardware, but disembodied in a way. And this notion of spirit is something that we lost after the Enlightenment, when we tried to deal with the wrong Christian metaphysics and superstition that came with it, and threw out a lot of babies with the bathwater. And suddenly we basically lost a lot of concepts, especially this concept of software that existed before in a way, this software being a control pattern or a pattern of causal structure that exists at a certain level of coarse graining, as some type of very, very specific physical law that we exist by looking at reality from a certain angle. And what I liked about your work is that you systematically have focused on this direction of what a cell can do, that a cell is an agent, and that levels of agency emerge in the interaction between cells. And And you use a very clear language and clear concepts, and you obviously are driven by questions that you want to answer, which is unusual in science. I found like most of our contemporaries in science get broken at, if it doesn't happen earlier during the PhD, into people who apply methods in teams instead of people who join academia because they think it's the most valuable thing they can do with their lives to pursue questions that they're interested in, want to make progress on.
All right, Michael, there's plenty to respond to.
Yeah. Well, lots of ideas. Yeah, I think it's very your point is very interesting about what really fundamentally is the difference between neurons and other cells. Of course, evolutionarily, they're reusing machinery that has been around for a very long time, since the time of bacteria, basically, right? So our unicellular ancestors had a lot of the same machinery, and even, I mean, of course, axons can be very long. But there are sort of intermediate structures, right? There are tunneling nanotubes and things that allow cells to connect to maybe 5 or 10 cell diameters away, right? So not terribly long, but also not immediate neighbors necessarily. So that kind of architecture has been around for a while, and people like Gorol Soel look at very brain-like electrical signaling in bacterial colonies. So this is, I think evolution began to reuse this toolkit specifically of using this kind of communication to scale up the computational and other kinds of tricks. A really long time ago, and I like to imagine that if somebody had come to the people who were inventing connectionism and the first, sort of perceptrons and neural networks and so on, if somebody had come to them and said, oh, by the way, sorry, we're the biologists. We got it wrong. It's not thinking isn't in the brain; it's in the liver. And so then the question is, what would they do, right? Would they have changed anything about what they're doing? And they said, now we have to rethink our model, or would they have said, fine, who cares? This is exactly the same model. Everything works just as well. So I often think about that question: what exactly do we mean by neurons? And isn't it interesting that we are able to steal most of the tools, the concepts, the frameworks, the math from neuroscience, and apply it to problems in other spaces. So not movement in three-dimensional space with muscles, but for example, movement through morphospace, right? Anatomical morphospace. The techniques can't tell the difference. We use all the same stuff: optogenetics, neurotransmitter signaling. We model active inference, and we see perceptual bistability. You name it. We take concepts from neuroscience and we apply it elsewhere in the body. And generally speaking, everything works exactly the same. And that shows us, I think, what you were saying, that there's this really interesting kind of symmetry between these that a lot of the distinctions that we've been making are, in terms of having different departments and different PhD programs and other things that say, this is neuroscience, this is developmental biology. A lot of these things are just not as firm distinctions as we used to think.
Yeah, I suspect that people who insist on strong disciplinary boundaries do this out of a protective impulse. And what I noticed I was studying many disciplines when I was young, that the different methodologies are so incompatible across fields that when I was studying philosophy or psychology, I felt that computer scientists would be laughing about the methods that each of these fields are using to justify what they're doing. Yeah. And this, I think, is indicative of a defect, because if you take science into the current regime of regulating it entirely by peer review, there is no external authority. Even the grant authorities are mostly people who have been trained in the sciences in existing paradigms and then are funding the continuation of those paradigms from the outside. This meta-paradigmatic thinking does not really exist that much in a peer-reviewed paradigm. And ultimately, when you do peer review for a couple generations, it also means that if your peers deteriorate, there is nothing who pulls your science back. And what I miss specifically in a lot of the way in which neuroscience is done is what you call the engineering stance. And this engineering stance is very powerful, and you get it automatically when you're a computer scientist, because you don't really care what language is it written in. What you care in is what causal pattern is realized, and how can this be realized. And how could I do it? How would I do it? How can evolution do it? What means are at its disposal? And this determines the search space for the things that I'm looking for. But this requires that I think in causal systems. And this thinking in causal systems is not impossible to, it's impossible not to do for a computer scientist. But it is unusual outside of computer science. And once you realize that, it's very weird. Yeah. And suddenly you have notions that try to replace causal structure with, say, evidence. And then you notice that, for instance, evidence-based medicine is not about probabilities of how something is realized and must work. Like you see people on a cruise ship getting infected over distances, and you think, oh, this must be airborne. But no, there is no peer-controlled study, so there is no evidence that it's airborne. And when you look at its disciplines from the outside, like in this case, the medical profession or the medical messaging and decision making, or I get terrified because it directly affects us. And in terms of neuroscience, of course, that is more theoretical for the most part, but there must be a reason why it's for the most part atheoretical, why there is no causal model that clinicians can use to explain what is happening in certain syndromes that people are exhibiting. And I noticed this when I go to a doctor, and even at a reputable institution like Stanford, that most of the neuroscientists at some level there, or most of the neurologists that I'm talking to at some level dualists, that they don't have a causal model of the way in which the brain is realizing things. And a lot of studies which discover that very simple mechanisms like the ability of human beings to use grammatical structure are actually reflected in the brain. This is so amazing. Who would have thought?
If you're hungry for deeper dives into physics, AI, consciousness, philosophy, along with my personal reflections, you'll find it all on my Substack. Subscribers get first access to new episodes, new posts as well, behind-the-scenes insights, and the chance to be a part of a thriving community of like-minded pilgrimers. By joining, you'll directly be supporting my work and helping keep these conversations at the cutting edge. So click the link on screen here, hit subscribe, and let's keep pushing the boundaries of knowledge together. Thank you and enjoy the show. Just so you know, if you're listening, it's CurtJaimungal.org, CurtJaimungal.org.